Hello, I'm Dan Rothbart. I'm a professor here at SCAR, and I'd like to thank Professor Mark Gopin for giving me this opportunity to speak with you today as it were, a visitor to your class, 813 on Qualitative Foundations of Humanities, which is an outstanding class. I think you're all very fortunate to take a class like this. I've seen the syllabus, and it's just excellent. The reason, by the way, I have to do this video is I teach at the same time, so I can't really be like both places. As far as I know with the recent physics, I have to just be at one place. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to talk about issues. Professor Gopin asked me to do philosophy of social science, and I want to talk about philosophy of social science, and I want to talk about positivist perspective and an anti-positivist perspective, and link it to, of course, conflict research and conflict theory, conflict analysis. So some of these issues I think you are very familiar with. Some maybe you're not familiar with, but I want to give a broad-based perspective, just highlight key points. So the first theme, and by the way, I have notes. I'm going to read the paper copy of the notes. I'm sending you the e-version, and I will ask Professor Gopin to distribute those before class. And I'm always available. I would thoroughly enjoy speaking with you individually or some other way about any of these topics. I find them very interesting. So one theme or topic I want to address today is the contrast between the positivist view of science and the anti-positivist view of science. And I know you have heard a lot about this at kind of the theoretical level. This is very important to understand the underpinnings of what we do in research, what we do in analysis. I mean, it's obviously important because you know that analysis is the systematic study of the conditions, causes, and consequence of conflict. And so there are a lot of assumptions about that study. There's a lot of debate about how that's achieved. How do we achieve analysis? How do we achieve genuine knowledge of conflicts, as opposed to the contrast of political propaganda or subjective bias? And so it's a challenge that intersects with general issues in philosophy, in particular issues about the conditions for knowledge. So the positivist perspective basically assumes that there is such thing as objective knowledge, objective inquiry, which can, when done properly, give us genuine knowledge. The goal of that, so now here are some features of the positivist perspective to science. Well, the goal of scientific inquiry, and by the way, this does apply to conflict analysis because many people in our field conform or endorse the positivist perspective. So the goal of inquiry is three goals, actually. The goals are the following three. First, an accurate description of phenomena. Second, a valid causal explanation of the phenomena, why they arose in the ways they do. And third, reliable predictions of phenomena. Those are the three positivist goals, or goals from a positivist perspective. By the way, predictions are pretty, how should we say, dicey at best, and some people say impossible to be precise. You can always have vague predictions, but precise ones are pretty much lost in conflict analysis, and pretty much lost by virtually all the social sciences in the positivist perspective. Now, with those goals, the question is, well, what constitutes knowledge? What is it? What are the elements of knowledge? And there are three elements of knowledge. And the first element of knowledge is empirical evidence, the data, information. Usually the data are supposed to be observable, something you see, you can detect. Anyone could detect an observable feature, movement, people's movement, number of people in a certain region, population, characteristics of people. So that's the first element of knowledge. The second element of knowledge comprise empirical concepts. So first you have data, and then you have concepts. Concepts are constructs. There are ideas that people make up, which presumably each idea, if it's an empirical concept, it ranges over a set of possible properties. So there's empirical concepts of color, of the number of people in a town, the concept of people afflicted with a disease, concept of poverty, which turns out to be extremely complicated, much involving many more features than a low level of wealth. There's many kinds of empirical concepts. And just to mention a few, opinion studies are suitable for empirical concept. A percentage of Americans supporting President Obama's proposal to criminalize purchase of assault rifles. So you have a variable there, percentage of people who believe such and such. Another variable, a concept capturing a variable, number of homeless people in a city. That's rather important, obviously, in our field. Turns out to be, that's a little tricky, because the question, how do you determine that someone's homeless? Does homeless mean being without a home for a day, being without a home for a week, living in their car? I just talked to someone yesterday, as a matter of fact, who said he was living in his car and that he was homeless. So that seemed to be, a sad case of a person who was homeless living out of his car. Another concept, percentage of people in California living below the poverty level. Again, poverty is a particularly important and difficult concept. So that's the second element of scientific knowledge within the positivist view. The third element of knowledge is what's called empirical generalization. It's a pattern. It's a statement, it could be a hypothesis, that captures the relationship among two or more concepts. So some generalizations are correlations. That is, you can have a generalization about the relationship between people in poverty and people in a certain ethnic group. A generalization that so many people in poverty, a certain percentage of people in poverty in California are from a particular ethnic group. That's a typical kind of generalization. So some are correlations, and then other kinds of generalizations are causal. That one variable represents a causal factor in the production of another variable. Obviously, we talk in our field a lot about the causal link between poverty and the tendency to deal with difference through conflict or violence. So again, the generalization, poverty level as one concept, and the degree of violence committed by members of a group as another concept. That hypothesis, by the way, is extremely difficult to prove, but it is absolutely critical. It turns out, by the way, that many of the important issues in our field, and now I'm just going to give a kind of critical reflection about positivism. Positivism claims to be based on evidence, empirical data, as you know, and then building up from there to concepts and hypotheses. The odd thing about the positivist perspective is that it's extremely narrow in the realm of what can be known. It's too narrow. In fact, when it comes to issues of causes of conflict, the positivist perspective cuts off or declares as illegitimate so many possible causal factors. Consider structural violence. Structural violence, the concept, as Galtung articulated it, I think quite brilliantly, is an invisibility. We never see the actual, quote, entity called structural violence. We see, of course, its effect as material violence or physical violence, obviously, but we never see the entity that we might call structural violence per se. Therefore, it seems to violate the positivist perspective. In fact, the very idea of a structure is an invisibility. Structures are invisible, which parallels something, by the way, in the physical sciences. Gravity is invisible. We see the effects of gravity. And all the forces are invisible in the physical sciences. So the problem of, quote, seeing the causal factors underlying conflicts is a kind of parallel to a general problem in all of the sciences, even the physical sciences, of, quote, seeing the causes, the causal forces of nature. And this is a major problem. In fact, all of the three elements I just mentioned have been subject to extreme criticism from various quarters in academics. The idea of evidence, never pure entirely, according to many people. I think that's been shown quite clearly. The idea of empirical concepts as potentially contaminated by bias or even political ideology is well documented. And then, of course, generalizations themselves seem to be too narrow in their scope, at least within the positivist frame. So I agree with many people in the social sciences that we need to broaden out the standards, the philosophical framework, in order to understand the causal conditions of conflict or the causal conditions of virtually any behavior interaction. So that brings us to the anti-positivist perspective, or I should say perspectives. And this is very prominent, this has been prominent in what's called the interpretive sciences. The interpretive sciences obviously include anthropology, include social psychology, certain fields in sociology, obviously history, and many other areas. So the main goal of interpretive sciences is to examine human action, human interaction, encounters, usually in their social settings, although not always, not all researchers in this, but usually in their, quote, natural social settings, or at least possibly in that. In particular, the interpretive sciences seek to examine the, as it were, sources of human interaction. And the study of violence, obviously, is a major topic. The study of bigotry, stigmatization, prejudice. This has been very much prominent. The interpretive sciences really surged in prominence with the flourishing of studies of race relations, gender bias, and various forms of bigotry. So that's the general idea, is to understand the underlying sources of this, and I realize that this is a major topic in this course that you're taking and other courses at the doctoral level. Now, this is a huge topic of study, as it were, the philosophical underpinnings. That's my concern, are the philosophical underpinnings of the interpretive sciences. So what I want to do is just briefly highlight three approaches to the study of human action from the perspective of the interpretive sciences. So the first one, is, you know very well, is ethnography. And ethnography is absolutely vital for understanding, as it were, the cultural underpinnings of human behavior, of social interaction. And ethnography, and we are very fortunate, by the way, at our school to have four very highly recognized anthropologists whose work I think has contributed significantly to the field and who you have an opportunity to study with. So ethnography basically provides a method for understanding social encounters. In particular, the method is to focus on the symbolic meaning of various patterns of interaction. So the symbolic nature of various patterns of human interaction. And of course, one of the prominent figures here, one of the towering figures, is Clifford Geertz, whose book, Interpretations of Culture, is a classic. I think everybody should read it. It's a great read, very exciting. So the assumption here is that to understand social interaction, we have to understand what the action or behavior means to, of course, the agent. What does it mean to an observer? It's kind of like second tier interpretation, like a witness. And what does it mean to some outside observers? So let me repeat that. I didn't quite say that perfectly. We could ask, what does the action mean to the actor, the agent? What does it mean to someone listening, like across the table or in a conversation? That's the second. And the third would be, what does the action mean to some outside observer? Maybe even someone doing ethnography or someone from another culture. So the assumption here, in order to understand the symbolic meaning, we need to understand the conceptual frame with which the agent, or anyone interpreting, is operating. What is the conceptual frame of the agent? How does the agent view the world? What are the primary categories? So, for example, we could talk about adherence to a particular religious order. And these adherents, of course, have a particular frame, a particular understanding of the world, which allows them to make sense of experiences, to give meaning to an observation, to an event, possibly even to predict a set of events, to set up some expectations. So the conceptual frame becomes kind of cognitive tools, as it were, instruments in the mind that are shared, cognitive tools for making sense of the world and for finding one's own place in the world. That's one very important value of virtually any culture, is it enables its adherents to establish a kind of orientation in a group, and to orient one's group in relation to other groups. So this speaks to the importance of intra-group positioning, and it also speaks to the importance of inter-group positioning. So that's very important, and obviously there's very much important elements about fine-tuning the method of ethnography. A second method, and let me just stress here, there are many methods for doing for engaging in interpretive science. There are many interpretive methods, and many of the social sciences, sociology, anthropology, as I mentioned, history, have developed their own method for interpreting and understanding events. One that I find particularly intriguing is called the dramaturgical methodology for understanding social encounters. And this was advanced most prominently by a sociologist named Erving Goffman, Irving Goffman basically set up a model and a set of techniques for explaining, for understanding social encounter. And the main theme here is that every social encounter can be understood through the lens of a drama, as it were, a theoretical frame. So every encounter is a drama that demands, or that consists of interaction among actors. Of course, there are writers of the drama, and there's audience members. Now, frequently, the actors are also writing their own script in real time as they're interacting. Of course, an obvious question is, are the actors also retrieving scripts that they learned from the past, from their parents, and so on? So this is obvious, by the way, it's really quite clear, in formal meetings, formal rituals, and ceremonies. That, and it's obvious when you do a formal ritual for the first time. You obviously have to be taught. Wedding ritual, people take on a position as if they're an actor. They take on, as it were, a persona. Military ceremony, graduation events, you have and you will participate in a graduation event, and you will be told where to stand and so on, which, by the way, I find always one of the things everyone is looking for in a graduation event are the people who violate the rules, are the people who deviate from the lesson. And that makes it more fun, obviously, especially in graduation. I don't know if it makes it more fun in a wedding ritual. That's another thing, especially for the bride and groom. But then, of course, this theme can be applied even for informal episodes, for parties, expressions of friendship, even for something as innocuous or ordinary as standing side by side in an elevator with a stranger. In an elevator with a stranger, there have been actually interesting studies about the cultural difference, cultural variation in one's physical space, one's physical presence. In an elevator, different cultures will promote different forms of interaction, how strangers interact with each other, what persona is portrayed by someone in an elevator, which of course depends on what they want to portray, what they want to convey, and so on. So an actor on the dramaturgical model exhibits a kind of person type that they accept, that they rely on, and that they learn. This is obvious in professional relations between doctors and patients, patients and nurses, and so on, as obvious when you have the unfortunate situation of having to stay in a hospital over a period of time. You can see that there is a culture to a hospital. Now, in our field, there's I think, a very clear example of this in some of the rhetoric of the extremist terrorist fighters, as it were, certain members of what's called the new terrorists. I know we've gone through these kind of examples in other classes very often, but there's oftentimes their understanding can be looked on in terms of a dramaturgical approach, as if they are actors on a stage, either to their own compatriots or their own fellow fighters, or, of course, to the world. So one example is a statement left by the so-called London bomber. As you recall, there's an alleged leader of a group responsible for the London bombings in July of 2005. And he left a message, and he basically adopted the position that he and his fellow soldiers are engaged in war against the British government and against its citizens. So he writes here, "This is how our ethical stances are dictated. Your democratically elected governments perpetuate atrocities against my people, and your support of them makes you responsible, you being the citizens. Until we feel secure, you'll be our target. Until you stop the bombing, gassing, imprisonment, and torture of my people will not stop this fight. We are at war, and I am a soldier. And that was the written words of Mohammed Sadiq Khan, and published in the Guardian. Now, this has very clear dramaturgical elements to it. He is taking on the persona of a soldier who is committed to defending my people. It's not clear who exactly. Is that all Muslims? Is it all Arabs? But he is, as it were, taking on the high moral course. And he is attacking, of course, the government as well as the citizens of a democratic government. And he is placing himself at a very, as I say, elevating himself to a position of considerable moral supremacy over the citizens, recognizing that he's about to kill people who are arguably innocent, possibly children, non-combatants clearly, and he's rationalizing this to the world by positioning himself in line with the defenders of his people, and then accusing the civilians of complicity in this kind of brutality. So this has dramaturgical elements to it. Clearly there are other factors, but that drama is a kind of model with which we can provide some understanding for his actions. Okay, so that's one frame for doing the engaging in interpretive sciences. Another frame, very different, although there are some similarities, another frame for engaging or deploying methods of interpretive science comes from social psychology, and it's known as positioning analysis. Positioning analysis basically assumes that each person is kind of situated, each person in a social encounter is situated by their relation, by basically their normative relation to that person. And this is obvious in a power dynamic. If a person has power over another person, let's say, we deal with this all the time. When we are driving, a police officer has, presumably according to the laws of a community, has power to engage in certain kind of prohibitive action stopping us, and we are obligated under certain conditions. So that's a kind of legal positioning, but also there are moral relations or moral obligations that are based on custom and mores and the local moral order. So positioning analysis is very useful for understanding social stereotyping. And you know what happens in social stereotyping, that an individual is kind of like tagged for some, usually some external characteristic. Maybe they start sneezing, you think they have SARS, or they're tagged for the terrible clothes that they wear, so they're attributed to being poor, or they might be tagged something even more severe, tagged because of racial bigotry. So what happens in stereotyping is that some observable characteristic is interlinked inseparably with character negative character traits, usually denigrating, insulting, or dehumanizing character traits. And obviously this is when stereotyping becomes just flagrant bigotry. So a positioning analysis of this would draw upon the explicit or implicit moral obligations or moral kind of character assassination in some cases, or projection of vices, projection assumptions about their limited capacity. This was so clearly and strikingly illustrated in the Jim Crow South. For over 100 years in the South, there were literally hundreds and hundreds of explicit laws, as you know, that designated the limitations of, quote, colored people, but there were also many tacit moral customs that basically stigmatized, quote, Negro people for various forms of character inabilities or character traits. And a positioning analysis, I think, goes a long way for delving into the details of this. Now, very different context here. We certainly can identify the positioning associated with ethnic denigration, and this is very flagrant in the prelude to war, when the prelude and during war, military and political leaders will denigrate, will stigmatize and denigrate the martial forces of the enemy, and certainly even the civilians of the enemy. So one example that we did, a number of us did a research study on the Second Lebanon War in 2006, where Hezbollah was uniformly denounced by the Israeli leadership for their terrorism against innocent Israelis. And one passage I found particularly striking. This was a testimony by Eli Ishay, who was the trade minister during the Winograd Committee hearings. The committee was assigned with the task of investigating this war. And his testimony basically reinforced a very denigrating positioning of Hezbollah. And here's a couple of lines from that. He said, "Hezbollah are guerrillas, they come to die. They come to commit suicide, they come to kill. Our purpose, meaning the Israeli Defense Force, purpose is to preserve the order. We spare human life. We sometimes risk the life of our own people while fighting in enemy buildings, which I strongly oppose," he says, "and we do this in order not to harm the enemy innocent civilians, while they use their own children as human shields against IDF. It is terrible. They take advantage of our humanistic army, our high moral," I think he meant high moral standards, "which I do not think there is an army in the entire world with such high moral standards as the IDF." So here we have a stunning polarity of moral, how should we say, moral essentialism. I mean, it's positioning in a very striking form. They basically are committed to suicide, they come to kill, as if they're obsessed. This insinuates or suggests an essentialism. It suggests a kind of obsession, kind of not rational, obviously, not strategic, and then they do virtually horrific acts of putting their children as human shields against the IDF. and we, in contrast, and so on, have the highest moral standards. We, the IDF, basically are the military with the highest moral standards in the world. So this is, I think, a kind of moral bigotry, an essentialism that can be understood in terms of a positioning system, which basically he is, in effect, positioning one group as, in terms of its high moral character, that's essentialist and virtually unchanging, in contrast to Hezbollah, which basically is committed to this. By the way, the point of understanding Elie Ishey is not, in this analysis, the point here is not to look at necessarily the truth or falsity of what he says, but rather to understand more deeply the implications, as it were, the symbolic meaning at various levels of understanding to the symbolic meaning of his statements. What does the statement mean about him? What does it mean about IDF? What does it mean about them? And of course, meaning of future possible events. So that example illustrates the positioning analysis, and I think I will stop at this point. Basically, what we've just done is give an overview of the key elements of positivism, a couple of objectives to positivism. There's many, many more objectives, objections, I should say, objections to positivism. There's many more that I didn't mention. And then, of course, 3 models that are appropriate for the interpretive sciences. So, again, I hope this was helpful, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, and I'd like to chat with you in another venue. So, thank you very much.